The midnight screams that echoed across Magnolia Bend Plantation in the Mississippi Delta weren't coming from the living. They were coming from the vengeful spirit of Ezra Solomon, the enslaved man who had died under Master Cornelius Blackwood's whip 6 months earlier, but refused to accept death as the end of his war against oppression. Standing in the shadow of the ancient cypress tree, where his broken body had drawn its last breath, Ezra's translucent form pressed spectral hands against the blood-soaked earth and smiled with the terrible satisfaction of a soul that had discovered death was not a limitation, but a liberation from the constraints that had bound him in life. If you're ready to witness the most terrifying tale of supernatural vengeance in American history, where death becomes the gateway to ultimate justice rather than the end of resistance, hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what Ezra Solomon unleashed from beyond the grave will make you question everything you thought you knew about the boundaries between life, death, and the power of an unbreakable human spirit. The Spanish moss swayed without wind, as supernatural forces gathered around the plantation, like storm clouds pregnant with divine retribution, while Ezra's spirit began the haunting that would transform Magnolia Bend from Mississippi's most profitable cotton plantation into the most terrified household in the antebellum South. Tonight, Master Blackwood would learn that some chains cannot hold the human spirit, some graves cannot contain righteous fury, and some forms of justice operate beyond the reach of earthly law. The year was 1840, and the Mississippi Delta had reached the zenith of its grotesque prosperity, built upon the systematic brutalization of human souls who were worked to death in cotton fields that stretched to the horizon like white oceans of unpaid labor. The region's fertile alluvial soil, deposited by countless Mississippi River floods, had created agricultural conditions so perfect for cotton cultivation that planters could generate obscene wealth as long as they possessed sufficient human property to extract every ounce of productivity from the land. Magnolia Bend Plantation sprawled across 8,000 acres of the richest cotton land in Mississippi, its boundaries marked by ancient trees whose Spanish moss-draped branches had witnessed 2 generations of systematic human exploitation disguised as agricultural enterprise. The plantation derived its name from the massive magnolia trees that lined the approach to the main house, their white blossoms serving as monuments to beauty built upon suffering, their fragrant perfume masking the stench of human misery that permeated every corner of the property. Master Cornelius Blackwood, 43 years old and second-generation owner of Magnolia Bend, represented everything most vicious about the Delta's planter aristocracy, a man of imposing physical presence with steel-gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed incapable of recognizing the humanity in enslaved faces. He had inherited not only vast wealth, but also a tradition of cruelty that he had refined into an art form. His reputation for brutality extended throughout Mississippi, where even hardened overseers spoke of his methods in hushed tones that mixed professional admiration with human revulsion. Blackwood's approach to slave management combined the latest theories in agricultural efficiency with psychological techniques designed to break the human spirit so completely that rebellion became literally unthinkable. He had developed what he called scientific dehumanization, a system that reduced enslaved people to their most basic economic functions while systematically destroying every aspect of their humanity that might interfere with maximum productivity. The plantation house itself stood like a white temple to human greed, its Greek revival columns rising from a landscape carved out of primeval swampland by the labor of thousands of enslaved souls over 2 generations. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast rainbows over mahogany floors, polished by hands that would never know freedom, while oil paintings of Blackwood ancestors gazed down from walls with the smug satisfaction of men who had built their fortunes on the systematic degradation of other human beings. But it was in the slave quarters behind the big house where Magnolia Bend's true nature revealed itself. Here, in rows of crude cabins barely adequate for livestock, 400 human beings lived in conditions that would have shamed a conscientious farmer's animals. The cabins lacked proper ventilation, adequate sanitation, or protection from Mississippi's brutal climate extremes, serving as breeding grounds for diseases that killed 1 in 3 enslaved children before their 5th birthday. Among these 400 souls, Ezra Solomon had stood as both spiritual leader and focus of resistance, a man whose knowledge of Hoodoo traditions made him the most feared and respected figure in the quarters. At 35 years old, Ezra possessed the kind of quiet dignity that slavery could neither break nor claim, his dark skin bearing ritual scarification that marked him as initiated into mysteries that predated European colonization of the Americas. Ezra had been born on Magnolia Bend, son of a woman who possessed knowledge of African spiritual practices that had survived the Middle Passage and adapted to Mississippi conditions. From his mother, he had learned to read the signs in nature, to communicate with spirits who governed the invisible world, and to prepare the roots, herbs, and ritual objects that could heal or harm depending on the intention behind their use. The spiritual practices that Ezra had inherited and refined represented a sophisticated fusion of West African religions, Native American shamanism, and folk Christianity that provided enslaved people with forms of power their oppressors could neither understand nor fully suppress. Through careful manipulation of spiritual forces, practitioners could influence events, protect their communities, and strike back at those who harmed them in ways that transcended physical limitations. Ezra's cabin, slightly larger than the others due to his status as the plantation's unofficial spiritual advisor, contained the tools of a tradition that would have terrified any white person who understood their true significance. Dried herbs hung from rafters in patterns corresponding to ancient cosmological principles. Carved wooden figures served as vessels for powerful spirits, and at the center of the room stood an altar that combined Christian iconography with African symbols in a synthesis that allowed enslaved people to practice ancestral religions under their masters' noses. The confrontation that would ultimately lead to Ezra's death and supernatural resurrection had been building for months, as Blackwood became increasingly convinced that the Hoodoo man was undermining the psychological foundation of his plantation's management system. The master had noticed signs of what he interpreted as spiritual independence among his human property, work songs that seemed to carry coded messages, ritual objects hidden throughout the plantation grounds, and most disturbing of all, a decrease in the absolute terror that Blackwood viewed as essential to maintaining proper control. Blackwood's suspicions had crystallized into active hatred when he discovered evidence of what appeared to be organized resistance activities centered around Ezra's spiritual leadership. The discovery had come during one of the master's periodic searches of the slave quarters, raids designed to uncover forbidden items and demonstrate his absolute authority over every aspect of enslaved people's lives. Hidden beneath Ezra's floorboards, Blackwood had found a collection of items that violated every assumption he held about the proper relationship between master and slave. Carved figures that seemed to represent specific white people, roots and herbs arranged in patterns that suggested ritual purposes, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be a detailed record of plantation activities written in symbols that Blackwood couldn't interpret, but which clearly indicated a level of intellectual sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy. The confrontation that followed had been swift and characteristically brutal. Rather than simply punishing Ezra for possessing forbidden items, Blackwood had decided to make an example that would terrorize the entire enslaved community back into absolute submission. He had ordered Ezra tied to the plantation's whipping post during the hottest part of a Mississippi summer day, his body already weakened by years of inadequate nutrition and backbreaking labor. But instead of the usual flogging that might kill a man through blood loss and shock, Blackwood had devised something far more cruel, a slow death by exposure and systematic torture, carried out in full view of the slave quarters so that everyone would be forced to watch their spiritual leader die by degrees. The master had taken personal pleasure in describing to his victim exactly how his death would serve as a lesson to others who might be tempted to practice their heathen rituals on Christian soil. For 3 days, Ezra had hung from that post under Mississippi's merciless sun, while Blackwood provided just enough water to keep him conscious, but not enough to prevent his slow deterioration. The master had personally administered the beatings that gradually broke Ezra's body, while leaving his mind clear enough to understand the full extent of his suffering. Each lash had been calculated to maximize pain while prolonging consciousness, turning death itself into an instrument of psychological warfare against the enslaved community. But what Blackwood had not understood was that those 3 days of agony had provided Ezra with exactly the spiritual energy needed to craft the most powerful supernatural working in American folklore. Using techniques passed down through generations of African priests and Native American medicine men, the dying Hoodoo master had woven together spiritual forces that would ensure his death would become the beginning of his oppressor's destruction rather than the end of resistance. The curse that Ezra had crafted during his dying hours was designed to operate beyond the boundaries of physical existence, binding his spirit to the plantation grounds in ways that would allow him to continue his war against oppression from beyond the grave. Using knowledge of necromancy that white men dismissed as primitive superstition, he had transformed his approaching death into a gateway to powers that earthly authority could neither comprehend nor control. As Ezra drew his final breath beneath the ancient cypress tree that would become his spiritual anchor point, his dying words had been spoken in languages that combined African dialects with Native American tongues, but their meaning had been understood by every enslaved person who heard them. "Death will set me free to finish what life could not complete. Master Blackwood's torment begins where mine ends." The plantation's enslaved community had understood immediately that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple execution. They had seen their spiritual leader die with a smile on his lips and a light in his eyes that suggested victory rather than defeat. More importantly, they had felt the change in the very air around the plantation, as if some fundamental force had shifted in ways that would soon become terrifyingly apparent to their oppressors. The first signs that Ezra's supernatural working was taking hold had appeared within hours of his death, as Blackwood began experiencing disturbing phenomena that challenged his materialist worldview. Strange sounds echoed through the plantation house during the darkest hours of night, footsteps in empty corridors, voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, and the persistent sound of chains rattling without any visible source. But these early manifestations had been nothing compared to what was coming. The curse that Ezra had woven during his 3 days of dying was designed to work systematically, allowing Blackwood to understand exactly what was happening to him and why. The plantation owner would experience a gradual dissolution of everything that made his life worth living, as the man he had killed returned from beyond death to claim the justice that earthly law had never provided. The supernatural forces that Ezra Solomon had unleashed from beyond the grave would prove that some spirits refuse to be broken, some justice transcends physical limitations, and some forms of resistance become more powerful in death than they ever were in life. The Hoodoo Revenant of Mississippi was about to demonstrate that the grave could be a launching point for vengeance rather than its ending. As the moon reached its zenith over Magnolia Bend Plantation, casting shadows that moved according to supernatural rather than natural laws, the most terrifying haunting in American history was about to begin. Master Cornelius Blackwood would learn that killing a hoodoo man's body was only the first step in unleashing forces that could destroy him from dimensions he had never imagined existed. The memories that had shaped Ezra Solomon into Mississippi's most powerful hoodoo practitioner flowed through his supernatural consciousness like dark water through delta bayous, each one carrying the spiritual sediment that had transformed him from an enslaved child into a man capable of wielding forces that could transcend death itself. As his ghostly form materialized in the quarters where he had once lived, watching the terrified faces of people who had witnessed his brutal execution just hours earlier, Ezra's spirit drew strength from the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of African priests who understood that some battles could only be won from beyond the grave. Ezra had been born in 1805 to Mama Anansi, a woman whose knowledge of West African spiritual traditions had survived the Middle Passage and adapted to the harsh realities of Mississippi plantation life. His mother had been among the last generation of enslaved people who carried direct memories of African homeland, her body bearing ritual scarification that marked her as initiated into mysteries that white men dismissed as primitive superstition, but which represented humanity's oldest covenant with forces beyond the physical world. The spiritual education that had prepared Ezra for his ultimate destiny as a supernatural avenger had begun when he was barely old enough to walk, under the guidance of his mother and the plantation's other spiritual practitioners who maintained African traditions in secret. In hidden clearings deep within Mississippi's swamplands, young Ezra had learned to recognize the distinctive patterns that governed spiritual energy, to prepare ritual objects that could channel supernatural forces, and to enter trance states that allowed direct communication with entities whose power predated human civilization. The ancestors are always watching, Mama Anansi had taught her son during their midnight lessons in the cypress groves that surrounded Magnolia Bend. They see every injustice, remember every cruelty, and they will use the living as instruments of their wrath when the time comes for justice. But some souls are chosen to carry this work beyond death itself, to become bridges between the world of the oppressed and the realm of divine retribution. The Hoodoo tradition that would eventually enable Ezra's posthumous revenge had its roots in the sophisticated religious systems of West Africa, but it had been strengthened and refined by the crucible of slavery that had forged new spiritual practices from the fusion of African, Native American, and Christian traditions. This synthesis had created something unprecedented in human religious experience, a system that could channel supernatural forces with scientific precision while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to any circumstances that oppression might create. Ezra's training had encompassed far more than the manipulation of spiritual forces. Under his mother's tutelage, he had learned the complex oral traditions that preserved his people's real history, the astronomical knowledge that allowed accurate prediction of spiritual cycles, the medical practices that had kept African communities healthy for millennia, and the sophisticated philosophy that governed relationships between individuals, communities, and the divine realm. But it was the knowledge of death magic, the spiritual practices that dealt directly with the realm of ancestors, and the power to bind one's own spirit to earthly purposes after physical death that represented the most dangerous aspect of Mama Anansi's teachings. Ezra had learned techniques that could allow conscious spirits to remain anchored to physical locations, methods for channeling supernatural energy through material objects, and most crucially, the protocols for transforming one's own death into a weapon that could destroy enemies long after the body had returned to dust. Master Cornelius Blackwood's systematic cruelties had provided Ezra with both the motivation and the spiritual energy needed to craft his supernatural working. The plantation owner's approach to slave management went far beyond simple economic exploitation, representing a form of psychological warfare designed to destroy every aspect of human dignity that might interfere with absolute submission to white authority. Blackwood's most sadistic innovation had been what he called educational theater, public spectacles designed to teach specific lessons about the consequences of resistance while providing entertainment for white visitors who came to Magnolia Bend specifically to witness his creative approaches to human degradation. These performances might involve forcing enslaved parents to participate in the punishment of their own children, creating psychological trauma that would last for generations and serve as ongoing reminders of white power's absolute nature. The master had also developed sophisticated techniques for breaking family bonds, understanding that emotional connections between enslaved people represented the greatest threat to the psychological control he sought to maintain. Children were routinely separated from their parents at increasingly young ages, not because of economic necessity, but because Blackwood believed that enslaved people who had nothing left to lose were more likely to become rebellious. Blackwood's cruelties extended to the most intimate aspects of enslaved people's lives, as he insisted on controlling not only their labor, but their emotional and spiritual existence. He had forbidden the practice of African traditions, the use of native languages, and even the formation of lasting romantic relationships between enslaved people, viewing all of these as threats to the total dominance he sought to achieve. Ezra had watched these atrocities with the terrible patience that his spiritual training had taught him, understanding that premature action would only result in greater suffering for his community. But each act of cruelty had been carefully catalogued in his memory, and he had begun the slow, methodical process of preparing for the day when the ancestors would demand justice for the accumulated suffering of his people. The network of resistance that Ezra had built around his spiritual leadership extended throughout Magnolia Bend and beyond, involving both enslaved people and the few free blacks who risked their precarious status to support Underground Railroad activities. Using coded messages embedded in work songs, ritual objects hidden throughout the plantation grounds, and ceremonial gatherings disguised as Christian prayer meetings, Ezra had created a communication system that allowed coordinated resistance to flourish beneath the noses of white authority. The spiritual preparation that had enabled Ezra's supernatural revenge had required years of careful work. As he slowly gathered the knowledge and materials needed to craft a curse that could operate beyond the boundaries of physical existence. He had spent decades learning the true names and spiritual vulnerabilities of every white person connected to Magnolia Bend's operations, understanding that effective supernatural warfare required detailed intelligence about one's enemies. The most crucial element of his preparation had been the creation of what he called the Anchor Network, a series of ritual objects buried throughout the plantation grounds in patterns that corresponded to ancient African cosmological principles. These objects, ranging from carved bones to specially prepared roots, would serve as spiritual tethering points that would allow his ghost to maintain a physical presence at Magnolia Bend long after his body had been destroyed. The confrontation that had ultimately led to Ezra's execution had been triggered by Blackwood's discovery of what appeared to be organized resistance activities centered around the Hoodoo man's spiritual authority. The Master's investigation had uncovered evidence of secret meetings, forbidden rituals, and what looked like detailed intelligence gathering about white activities on and around the plantation. The torture that Blackwood had inflicted upon Ezra during his final 3 days had been designed not just to kill, but to break the spiritual leader's influence over the enslaved community by demonstrating the futility of resistance against white power. The Master had taken personal pleasure in describing to his victim exactly how his death would serve as a permanent reminder to other enslaved people about the consequences of challenging established authority. But what Blackwood had failed to understand was that those 3 days of systematic torture had provided Ezra with exactly the spiritual conditions needed to complete his great working. The intense physical and emotional suffering had opened channels of communication with the ancestral realm that normally remained closed to living practitioners, while the approaching transition from life to death had given him access to forms of power that could only be wielded by those who had nothing left to lose. The curse that Ezra had woven during his dying hours combined elements from multiple spiritual traditions, creating a supernatural architecture that could support his consciousness after physical death, while providing him with the ability to influence events in the world of the living. Using techniques that had been developed by African priests, Native American shamans, and folk practitioners throughout the Americas, he had transformed his approaching death into a weapon more terrible than any earthly force. The ritual components that Ezra had prepared over years of secret work had been strategically placed throughout Magnolia Bend's grounds, creating a network of spiritual anchor points that would allow his ghost to manifest with increasing power as time passed. Each buried object had been charged with specific intentions and connected to particular aspects of his planned revenge, ensuring that his supernatural assault on Blackwood would unfold in carefully orchestrated phases. As Ezra's spirit began to manifest in the hours following his physical death, the enslaved community of Magnolia Bend experienced a collective awakening that challenged every assumption they had been forced to accept about their powerlessness. The man they had watched die under Blackwood's whip was returning to them with abilities that transcended every limitation that slavery had tried to impose, proving that some forms of resistance could become more powerful in death than they had ever been in life. The first supernatural manifestations had been subtle but unmistakable to those who possessed the spiritual sight to recognize them. Ezra's ghostly form appeared to individual enslaved people during the darkest hours of night, providing comfort to the grieving while delivering messages about the vengeance that was coming for their oppressors. These visitations carried a spiritual authority that convinced witnesses they were encountering something far more significant than wishful thinking or grief-induced hallucinations. The plantation's spiritual atmosphere began to change in ways that even white people could sense, though they lacked the knowledge needed to understand what was happening around them. The air itself seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made everyone nervous and prone to unexplained fears. Animals throughout the property became increasingly agitated, while the very plants seemed to respond to invisible forces that were reshaping the spiritual landscape of Magnolia Bend. Master Blackwood's initial encounters with supernatural phenomena had been dismissed as products of temporary stress following the dramatic execution he had orchestrated. Strange sounds in the plantation house, glimpses of figures that vanished when looked at directly, and the persistent feeling of being watched by invisible eyes were all attributed to the natural aftermath of intense emotional events. But as the manifestations grew stronger and more specific, Blackwood was forced to confront evidence that challenged his materialist worldview and threatened the psychological foundations upon which his authority rested. The man he had killed was returning to claim a justice that earthly law had never provided, using methods that white civilization had no framework for understanding or resisting. If this story of supernatural justice and otherworldly revenge has captured your imagination and made you want to know how Ezra's ghostly war against his former master unfolds, make sure to hit that like button right now to show your support for these incredible tales of resistance that transcend even death itself. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the most extraordinary stories history tried to bury, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers around the world who appreciate these forgotten stories of courage, supernatural power, and ultimate justice. The stage was now set for a confrontation between earthly power and spiritual justice, between the temporary authority of slave owners and the eternal judgment of forces that operated beyond the reach of human law. Ezra Solomon's transformation from executed slave to supernatural avenger was about to demonstrate that some battles could only be won from beyond the grave, and that death itself could become the ultimate weapon against oppression. The supernatural storm that had been building over Magnolia Bend Plantation for 6 months reached its devastating crescendo on the anniversary of Ezra Solomon's execution, as forces older than human civilization itself converged upon the Mississippi Delta to deliver a justice that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The ancient cypress tree where Ezra had died began to weep tears of blood that stained its Spanish moss crimson, while the very air around the plantation thickened with otherworldly energy that made breathing feel like drowning in liquid darkness. Master Cornelius Blackwood cowered in his study as the mahogany walls began to pulse with supernatural heartbeats, their surfaces becoming transparent to reveal the spiritual realm where thousands of enslaved souls waited with instruments of torture that mirrored every cruelty he had inflicted during 2 decades of systematic brutality. The oil paintings of his ancestors had transformed into windows showing scenes from a hellish dimension where former masters served as property for the very people they had once owned, their screams echoing through dimensions that earthly law could never reach. "Tonight you learn what it means to be owned," whispered a voice that seemed to emerge from the floorboards beneath Blackwood's feet, carrying harmonics that spoke of collective rage accumulated over generations of oppression. "Tonight, you discover that death is not an escape from justice. It is the gateway to accountability that your earthly courts could never deliver." The voice belonged to Ezra Solomon, but it had been transformed by 6 months of spiritual growth beyond the grave into something far more powerful than any living hoodoo practitioner could ever become. The executed slave had evolved into a supernatural conduit for every ancestor whose blood had watered the cotton fields of the South, every soul whose suffering had been dismissed as the natural order by men who confused temporary power with permanent authority. Blackwood's final day of earthly existence began at midnight, with manifestations that would have driven most men immediately into gibbering madness. His reflection in every mirror throughout the plantation house showed not his own face, but a constantly shifting parade of the enslaved people he had tortured and killed over 2 decades of refined cruelty. Each face stared back at him with eyes that blazed with supernatural fire, their mouths moving in silent accusations that he could hear, despite the absence of sound. The crystal chandeliers in the main hall began to swing without any wind to move them, their pendulum motion creating patterns that spelled out the names of Blackwood's victims in languages that predated European colonization of the Americas. The mahogany furniture, polished to perfection by enslaved hands that would never know freedom, began to seep a red substance that wrote accusations across every surface in flowing script that seemed to etch itself into the wood with supernatural authority. The plantation's operations had completely collapsed as Ezra's supernatural influence extended beyond the main house to affect every aspect of Magnolia Bend's daily routine. The cotton fields that had been the source of Blackwood's wealth withered overnight as spiritual forces poisoned the soil, with the accumulated suffering of everyone who had ever worked those rows without compensation. The enslaved population experienced a collective liberation of spirit that manifested in ways their oppressors found impossible to comprehend or control. The overseers who had served as Blackwood's primary enforcers found their whips transforming into serpents that turned upon their wielders, while the bloodhounds trained to track runaway slaves cowered in terror from invisible predators that filled the air with the scent of something far more dangerous than any earthly creature. The plantation's carefully maintained hierarchy of control dissolved as supernatural forces demonstrated that earthly power was nothing compared to the authority of the ancestors. The climax of Blackwood's supernatural punishment began at the exact hour when Ezra had been tied to the whipping post 6 months earlier. The master found himself unable to leave his study, as if invisible chains had bound him to the very spot where he had planned so many acts of calculated cruelty. The room itself began to transform around him, its walls becoming permeable to reveal the spiritual landscape that existed beyond physical perception. What Blackwood saw in that otherworldly realm filled him with a terror so profound that his mind began to fracture under the weight of supernatural revelation. The plantation grounds were filled with thousands of spirits, not just those who had died at Magnolia Bend, but the collective souls of every person who had ever been enslaved, tortured, or murdered by white supremacist violence throughout the Americas. They stood in perfect formation like a supernatural army, assembled to witness the final judgment of a man whose crimes had offended the very foundations of cosmic justice. At the center of this spiritual gathering stood Ezra Solomon, but death had transformed him into something far more powerful than any mortal practitioner of Hoodoo could ever become. He wore robes that seemed woven from starlight itself, while his eyes blazed with the accumulated wisdom of every ancestor who had ever called down divine retribution upon human oppressors. In his spectral hands, he carried instruments of spiritual torture that would make Blackwood's physical whips seem like gentle caresses by comparison. "You believed that killing my body would end my resistance," Ezra spoke with a voice that carried the power of hurricane winds and earthquake tremors. "You thought that death would silence my opposition to your cruelty, but the ancestors have different laws than your earthly courts, and spiritual justice recognizes no limitations imposed by physical existence." The supernatural assault that Ezra had been preparing for 6 months began to manifest with devastating precision as the network of ritual objects he had buried throughout Magnolia Bend's grounds activated in sequence like a ghostly orchestra, tuned to frequencies that could shatter human sanity. Each anchor point released spiritual energy that had been accumulating since his death, creating a confluence of forces that transformed the plantation into a gateway between the world of the living and the realm of ultimate accountability. Blackwood's body began to experience the same systematic destruction that he had inflicted upon countless others, but accelerated and intensified by supernatural forces that could compress lifetimes of suffering into hours of unbearable agony. His flesh developed marks that corresponded exactly to every whip stroke he had ever delivered, while his bones began to crack in patterns that mirrored the injuries he had inflicted upon children, women, and men whose only crime had been their inability to escape his property. But the physical torment was insignificant compared to the psychological horror of understanding that this was only the beginning of his punishment. Through spiritual revelation that bypassed normal sensory channels, Blackwood was forced to experience every act of cruelty from the perspective of his victims, feeling the despair of parents watching their children sold away, the humiliation of human beings reduced to livestock status, and the soul-crushing weight of being owned by someone who viewed their suffering as entertainment. The enslaved community gathered outside the plantation house as supernatural forces reached their climax, drawn by an understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in American history, the complete spiritual destruction of a white master by forces summoned from beyond the grave. Many wept with joy as they felt the oppressive spiritual atmosphere that had defined their entire lives finally beginning to lift, replaced by the promise of justice delivered by ancestors who had never forgotten their suffering. As the confrontation intensified, Ezra's ghost began to manifest with increasing solidity, his spectral form gaining substance as it drew power from the spiritual energy that permeated Magnolia Bend's transformed landscape. The executed slave appeared before his former master as a figure of terrible beauty, his supernatural radiance illuminating the study where Blackwood had planned so many acts of calculated brutality. "Look upon me and see your judgment," Ezra commanded, his voice resonating through dimensions that existed beyond human perception. "I am death refusing to remain silent. I am suffering transformed into power. I am the price of every chain you forged, every family you destroyed, every dignity you trampled beneath your feet." The spiritual forces that Ezra controlled began to systematically dismantle the psychological foundations that had allowed Blackwood to function as a coherent personality. The master experienced the complete dissolution of his sense of self-worth as supernatural revelation forced him to confront the true nature of his crimes against humanity. Every justification he had ever constructed for his cruelties crumbled under the weight of divine judgment administered by entities whose authority superseded every earthly institution. The plantation house itself seemed to turn against its owner, as supernatural energy reshaped the very structure, according to spiritual rather than physical laws. Doors opened onto corridors that led to dimensions where former slaves held dominion over their former masters, while windows showed views of landscapes where justice operated according to principles that white civilization had never acknowledged or understood. The final phase of Blackwood's torment involved a complete reversal of the power relationship that had defined his existence, as Ezra's ghost subjected him to every form of degradation that slavery had ever inflicted upon human dignity. The master experienced the terror of being owned by forces beyond his comprehension, the humiliation of having his will completely subordinated to supernatural authority, and the despair of understanding that his suffering would continue beyond the boundaries of physical death. The moment when Blackwood's sanity finally shattered completely came as Ezra revealed the ultimate truth about the spiritual dimension of slavery, that every act of cruelty created karmic debts that accumulated across lifetimes, ensuring that oppressors would eventually experience the same suffering they had inflicted upon others. The master's screams echoed across the Mississippi Delta as he understood that his death would bring no relief from the justice that awaited him in realms where former slaves would become his eternal masters. The supernatural manifestations reached their peak as dawn approached, painting the Mississippi sky in shades of red that seemed to reflect the blood Blackwood had spilled over decades of systematic brutality. The plantation's enslaved population watched in awe as their former master was dragged screaming from his study by invisible forces, his body convulsing as Ezra's spirit demonstrated the ultimate powerlessness of earthly authority when confronted by supernatural justice. The transformation of Magnolia Bend from a functioning plantation into a haunted wasteland was completed within hours of Blackwood's final confrontation with his victim's ghost. The cotton fields withered completely as spiritual forces poisoned the soil with the accumulated suffering of generations, while the plantation house became uninhabitable as supernatural energy continued to operate according to the spiritual architecture that Ezra had constructed over months of careful preparation. The broader impact of Ezra's supernatural victory extended far beyond the boundaries of a single plantation, as word of the events at Magnolia Bend spread through Mississippi's slave-owning elite like a spiritual contagion that threatened the very foundations of their power. Plantation owners throughout the Delta began experiencing their own supernatural harassment, as if Ezra's great working had awakened dormant forces that had been waiting for the right catalyst to begin their own campaigns of otherworldly justice. The climax of supernatural vengeance had demonstrated that some forms of resistance could transcend every barrier that earthly authority tried to impose, proving that death itself could become the ultimate weapon against oppression. Ezra Solomon's transformation from executed slave to supernatural avenger had established principles of spiritual justice that would echo through the remaining decades of American slavery, inspiring both hope among the oppressed and terror among their oppressors. As the sun rose over the ruins of what had once been Mississippi's most profitable cotton plantation, the ancient cypress tree where Ezra had died stood as a monument to the power of the human spirit to transcend every limitation that tyranny could devise. The Hoodoo Revenant had won his war against oppression, proving that some battles could only be fought from beyond the grave, and that ultimate victory belonged to those who refused to let death silence their demand for justice. The transformation of Magnolia Bend Plantation from Mississippi's most profitable cotton empire into the most haunted location in American folklore unfolded over the months following Cornelius Blackwood's supernatural destruction, as the spiritual forces that Ezra Solomon had unleashed continued to operate with a power and persistence that defied every attempt at rational explanation or supernatural suppression. What had begun as one man's quest for posthumous justice evolved into a spiritual revolution that would ultimately contribute to the psychological collapse of slavery throughout the Mississippi Delta and establish Ezra as the most feared supernatural warrior in the history of the American South. The immediate aftermath of Blackwood's final confrontation with his victim's ghost plunged the plantation into chaos that reflected the continued operation of forces beyond human understanding. The master's widow, Cordelia Blackwood, discovered that the family's considerable wealth had mysteriously vanished. Bank accounts had been emptied by transactions that bore her husband's signature, but which no living person had authorized, while the plantation's valuable furnishings had been found destroyed by spiritual energies that left no trace of conventional vandalism, but had reduced priceless antiques to ash, arranged in patterns that resembled African ritual symbols. More disturbing still, potential buyers for the plantation reported experiencing the same supernatural harassment that had driven Blackwood to his death. Real estate agents who attempted to show the property found themselves confronted by apparitions of enslaved people who spoke in languages that predated European colonization, while prospective purchasers fled after witnessing phenomena that included bleeding walls, mirrors that showed scenes from the realm of the dead, and the persistent sound of drums that seemed to emanate from beneath the ground itself. Dr. Thaddeus Whitmore, theophysician and amateur researcher of supernatural phenomena, who had traveled from Natchez to document the events at Magnolia Bend, was confronted with evidence that challenged every assumption of materialist science. His detailed examination of the plantation house revealed that the supernatural manifestations followed consistent patterns that suggested intelligent direction rather than random paranormal activity, indicating the presence of a consciousness that had survived physical death and maintained the ability to influence the world of the living. "We are witnessing something that transcends the boundaries of conventional understanding," Dr. Whitmore wrote in his private journal, his usually precise handwriting betraying the emotional impact of what he was documenting. The phenomena at Magnolia Bend demonstrate a level of spiritual organization and purpose that suggests the existence of intelligences that operate beyond the limitations of physical existence. Most significantly, these forces appear to be executing a form of justice that our earthly legal systems have never been capable of delivering. The enslaved population that remained at Magnolia Bend found themselves in a situation that had no precedent in American history, as the spiritual forces that Ezra had summoned continued to protect them from anyone who might attempt to re-establish the old system of oppression. Several attempts by neighboring plantation owners to claim the abandoned property and its human assets had ended in supernatural disasters that sent the would-be slavers fleeing in terror, their minds shattered by encounters with forces that operated beyond the reach of earthly law. Most dramatically, Colonel Marcus Beaumont, the owner of a nearby plantation who had attempted to round up Magnolia Bend's enslaved people using armed overseers and bloodhounds, had found his expedition transformed into a nightmare of supernatural proportions. The dogs had refused to track their intended quarry, instead howling in terror at invisible predators that filled the air with the scent of something far more dangerous than any earthly creature. The overseers had reported being attacked by spirits that wielded whips of pure energy, leaving marks that burned like brands but disappeared within hours. The broader impact of Blackwood's supernatural destruction extended far beyond the boundaries of a single plantation, as word of the events at Magnolia Bend spread through Mississippi's slave-owning elite like a spiritual contagion that threatened the very foundations of their power. Plantation owners throughout the Delta began experiencing their own supernatural harassment, as if Ezra's great working had awakened spiritual forces that had been dormant throughout the region, waiting for the right catalyst to begin their own campaigns of otherworldly justice. Reports flooded into the offices of Mississippi's governor and legislature, describing phenomena that defied rational explanation, but which all pointed toward a systematic spiritual rebellion against the institution of slavery. Mirrors in plantation houses throughout the state began showing reflections that included the faces of deceased enslaved people. Work songs in the fields took on new meanings, as practitioners of African spiritual traditions used musical forms to coordinate resistance activities that white observers couldn't detect, but which created an underground network of supernatural communication. Most significantly, the death rates among plantation owners and overseers began to climb dramatically, with many succumbing to mysterious illnesses that physicians were unable to diagnose or treat. Those who survived reported being haunted by dreams of deceased enslaved people who spoke in African languages that the dreamers somehow understood, despite having no knowledge of these tongues. The dreams carried consistent messages. The ancestors were watching, judgment was coming, and the system of human bondage would not survive the spiritual forces that had been awakened by Ezra Solomon's sacrifice. The religious establishment's response to these events revealed the theological crisis that supernatural resistance posed to Christian justifications of slavery. Ministers who had spent their careers defending human bondage through selective biblical interpretation found themselves confronting evidence that the God they claimed to serve was answering the prayers of the oppressed rather than the oppressors, using methods that challenged every assumption about divine will and earthly authority. Reverend Jonathan Blackthorne, one of Mississippi's most prominent Methodist ministers and a vocal defender of slavery as divinely ordained, was forced to acknowledge the reality of what was occurring throughout the Delta in a sermon that would be remembered for generations. "We are witnessing signs and wonders that challenge our understanding of divine will," he admitted to his shocked congregation. "Perhaps the Almighty has chosen to work through means that our theology has not anticipated, using the very people we have held in bondage as instruments of his judgment upon a system that may not be as righteous as we have convinced ourselves." The economic impact of the supernatural rebellion was immediate and devastating, as plantations throughout Mississippi found themselves unable to maintain normal operations in the face of spiritual resistance that white authority could neither understand nor suppress. Cotton production plummeted as enslaved workers gained confidence from the knowledge that their ancestors were actively supporting their resistance, while the value of plantation properties collapsed as word spread about the supernatural phenomena that made them uninhabitable for anyone connected to their histories of brutality. Insurance companies began refusing to write policies covering plantation properties, while banks grew reluctant to accept enslaved people as collateral for loans, understanding that supernatural forces might render such human property worthless without warning. The economic foundation of the plantation system, which had seemed so solid just months earlier, was crumbling under the weight of forces that operated beyond the reach of earthly power. Meanwhile, Ezra Solomon had become a figure of mythic proportions throughout the enslaved communities of the South, spoken of in whispers as the man who had proven that spiritual power could triumph over even the most entrenched systems of oppression. His name was invoked in prayers and ceremonies from Virginia to Texas, as practitioners of African spiritual traditions drew inspiration from his example while developing their own methods of supernatural resistance. The Underground Railroad incorporated Ezra's story into their operations, using his example to encourage enslaved people to believe that freedom was not only possible, but spiritually inevitable. Harriet Tubman herself was reported to have spoken of Ezra during her rescue missions, describing him as a spiritual warrior whose victory over his oppressor proved that the ancestors were actively working to liberate their descendants from bondage. But perhaps the most significant impact of Ezra's supernatural victory was its effect on the enslaved people who had witnessed his triumph over Blackwood. Many reported experiencing a spiritual awakening that connected them to traditions and ancestors they had been forced to forget, while others began developing their own supernatural abilities that had previously remained dormant. The psychological chains that had kept millions of people in mental as well as physical bondage were beginning to break under the influence of spiritual forces that recognized no earthly authority. The plantation system's response to these challenges revealed the fundamental weakness that had always existed beneath its facade of absolute power. When confronted by resistance that operated beyond the reach of whips, chains, and legal institutions, the entire structure of oppression began to collapse like a house built upon foundations of sand. Emergency sessions of the Mississippi legislature attempted to address what politicians euphemistically termed unusual disturbances affecting plantation operations throughout the state. Various proposals were debated, ranging from increased penalties for superstitious practices among enslaved people to the importation of European exorcists specifically trained to combat African witchcraft. But all of these measures proved ineffective against forces that operated in spiritual dimensions that white authority could neither access nor control. The Civil War, which began 21 years after Ezra's supernatural victory, was interpreted by many as the fulfillment of prophecies that had been spreading through enslaved communities since the haunting of Magnolia Bend. The conflict was seen not merely as a political disagreement between North and South, but as a spiritual reckoning that had been initiated by ancestors who had grown tired of watching their descendants suffer in bondage. Union soldiers who liberated Mississippi in 1863 found Magnolia Bend Plantation still abandoned and haunted, its grounds patrolled by spiritual entities that local residents warned them against disturbing after dark. The property had become a pilgrimage site for freed enslaved people who came to pay their respects to the man whose posthumous sacrifice had proven that justice could transcend the boundaries between life and death. Archaeological expeditions to the site have uncovered evidence of the extensive network of ritual objects that Ezra buried throughout the plantation grounds, arranged in patterns that correspond to sophisticated African cosmological principles. These artifacts continue to emit measurable electromagnetic energy that defies conventional scientific explanation, suggesting that the spiritual architecture Ezra created remains active and functional despite the passage of more than 180 years. Modern paranormal investigators who have studied Magnolia Bend report that supernatural activity continues to this day, with visitors describing encounters with spiritual entities that seem to be replaying the final confrontation between the Hoodoo Revenant and his oppressor. The site has become one of the most documented haunted locations in the United States, with thousands of witnesses reporting phenomena that range from apparitions and disembodied voices to physical interactions with forces that exist beyond the boundaries of normal human perception. The story of Ezra Solomon and his supernatural victory over Cornelius Blackwood has become one of the most enduring legends in American folklore, representing both the ultimate expression of spiritual resistance against oppression and a testament to the power of ancestral traditions that survived every attempt at suppression. It serves as a reminder that justice sometimes takes forms that transcend earthly law, and that the human spirit possesses resources that no system of oppression can ultimately destroy. Educational institutions throughout the United States now include Ezra's story in curricula, dealing with the history of resistance to slavery, while spiritual practitioners worldwide study his methods as examples of how ancient traditions can be adapted to address contemporary forms of injustice. His legacy continues to inspire those who face seemingly impossible odds, proving that individual courage combined with spiritual knowledge can create ripple effects that transform entire societies. The haunted ruins of Magnolia Bend Plantation stand today as a monument to both the horrors of human bondage and the power of spiritual justice to transcend every barrier that earthly authority attempts to impose. The ancient cypress tree where Ezra died continues to weep its bloody tears each year on the anniversary of his execution, while the Spanish moss sways in patterns that spell out messages of hope for all who possess the vision to read them. The legacy of the Hoodoo Revenant reminds us that resistance takes many forms, and that the most powerful weapons against oppression may be those that operate in dimensions beyond physical sight. Ezra Solomon's transformation from executed slave to supernatural avenger proved that death itself could become a gateway to ultimate victory rather than final defeat, establishing principles of spiritual justice that continue to inspire those who fight against tyranny in all its forms. The story of Ezra Solomon challenges us to consider the hidden dimensions of resistance and the supernatural forces that may be awakened when human dignity is trampled beneath the weight of systematic oppression. If this tale of posthumous justice and spiritual triumph has moved you, amazed you, or made you think differently about the power of the human spirit to transcend even death itself, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with others who appreciate the forgotten stories of those who fought back against impossible odds, using weapons that earthly power could never understand or defeat. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of the extraordinary individuals whose supernatural victories continue to echo through the corridors of time, reminding us that some battles can only be won from beyond the grave.